What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down with a daytime television host who thinks she knows everything about his career, his choices, and his beliefs? What happens when that host pushes too far, says the wrong thing, and finds herself face to face with a man who refuses to back down? Today we're breaking down the most explosive confrontation ever captured on live television. A moment so intense that producers had no choice but to physically remove the host from her own show. Make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story will leave you speechless. The morning of February 15th started like any other day at the View Studios in New York City. Joy Behar arrived early, coffee in hand, scrolling through her notes for the day's biggest interview. Denzel Washington was scheduled to appear on the show to promote his latest directorial project, a film that had already sparked conversations across the country for its unflinching portrayal of systemic issues in America. Joy had done her research, or so she thought, and she was ready to make this interview memorable. "Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to The View," Joy announced to the live studio audience, her trademark smile plastered across her face. "We have a very special guest joining us today. He's a two-time Academy Award winner, a director, a producer, and someone who has never been afraid to speak his mind about the issues that matter most in our society. Please welcome the legendary Denzel Washington." The audience erupted in applause as Denzel walked onto the set, his presence commanding immediate respect. He was dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, his posture confident yet humble as he waved to the crowd. He took his seat across from Joy, and the energy in the room shifted palpably. This wasn't just any guest. This was Denzel Washington, and everyone knew they were about to witness something special. "Denzel, thank you so much for being here," Joy began, her tone warm but carrying an undertone that suggested she had an agenda. "I have to say, your new film has certainly gotten people talking. Some are calling it your most important work yet, while others have some concerns about the message you're trying to send." Denzel leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Joy, I appreciate you having me on the show. As for the film, I think it speaks for itself. We're telling a story that needs to be told, about real people facing real challenges in this country. If that makes some people uncomfortable, then maybe they need to ask themselves why. But don't you think," Joy interrupted, her voice taking on a more confrontational tone, "that as someone with your platform, your influence, you have a responsibility to be more, let's say, careful about the messages you're putting out there? I mean, this film of yours, it's pretty critical of law enforcement, pretty critical of our justice system. Don't you worry about the impact that might have?" The smile faded from Denzel's face, and he sat forward slightly, his eyes meeting Joy's directly. "Careful? Joy, I've been in this industry for over 4 decades. I've played cops, I've played criminals, I've played heroes and villains, but this film isn't about being careful, it's about being truthful. If the truth makes people uncomfortable, that's not my problem, that's theirs." Joy shifted in her seat, clearly not expecting such a direct response. She had interviewed countless celebrities over the years, most of whom were content to give safe, rehearsed answers to avoid controversy. Denzel Washington was clearly not going to be one of those guests. "Truthful," she repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. "But whose truth are we talking about here, Denzel? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're pushing a pretty specific narrative, one that paints our police officers, our justice system, in a very negative light. And I have to wonder, is that really fair?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Denzel's expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice was measured but firm. "Fair? Joy, let me ask you something. When a young black man gets pulled over for driving in the wrong neighborhood, is that fair? When a family loses their father, their son, their brother to police brutality, and the officer responsible gets a paid vacation, is that fair? We're not talking about fiction here. We're talking about reality. But surely you can't paint all law enforcement with the same brush." Joy countered, her voice rising slightly. There are good cops out there. Denzel. There are officers who put their lives on the line every day to protect our communities. Don't they deserve better than to be lumped in with the bad actors? Denzel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the studio was completely silent, except for the hum of the cameras. Of course there are good officers, Joy. But that's not what this conversation is about, is it? This is about you trying to put me in a box, trying to make me the angry black man who's anti-police. Well, I'm not going to play that game. I'm not trying to put you in any box, Joy protested. But her tone suggested otherwise. I'm simply asking legitimate questions about the responsibility that comes with your platform. You have millions of fans who look up to you, who trust your judgment. When you make a film that portrays law enforcement in such a negative light, don't you think you owe it to them, and to the officers themselves, to present a more balanced perspective? Denzel leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Joy's face. Let me tell you something about responsibility, Joy. My responsibility is to tell stories that matter, to shine a light on issues that too many people want to keep in the dark. If you want balance, turn on the evening news. They'll give you plenty of stories about heroic cops. But that's not the story I'm telling, because it's not the story that needs to be told right now. The tension in the studio was now palpable, with audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The other hosts of The View sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to intervene in what was quickly becoming a heated confrontation. Joy, however, seemed oblivious to the discomfort she was causing, pressing forward with her line of questioning. So you're saying that your version of the truth is the only one that matters? She asked, her voice taking on a mocking tone. That your perspective is more important than the perspectives of the thousands of law enforcement officers who risk their lives every day to keep us safe? That was the moment everything changed. Denzel's composure, which had been steady throughout the interview, despite Joy's increasingly aggressive questioning, finally cracked. Not in anger, but in something far more powerful. Disappointment mixed with a quiet fury that was somehow more intimidating than any outburst could have been. Joy, he said, his voice so quiet that the audience had to strain to hear him. I think you fundamentally misunderstand what's happening here. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Denzel's eyes locked onto Joy's, and for the first time since the interview began, she seemed to realize that she might have pushed too far. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, a decision that would prove to be her biggest mistake of the day. Oh, I understand perfectly, Joy shot back, her voice dripping with condescension. I understand that you've made a career out of playing the victim, out of pointing fingers instead of taking responsibility. And now you want to use your fame to push some sort of anti-establishment agenda. Well, I'm sorry, Denzel, but some of us live in the real world. The collective gasp from the studio audience was audible. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, unsure if they should keep rolling. This had gone far beyond a heated interview and into territory that no one was prepared for. But Joy, emboldened by what she perceived as having the upper hand, continued her attack. You sit there in your ivory tower, she continued, gesturing dismissively, making millions of dollars while ordinary Americans, including police officers, struggle to make ends meet and keep our communities safe. And then you have the audacity to lecture us about truth and justice? Give me a break. Denzel stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow over the interview table. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath the surface. Joy, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because I'm only going to say it once. Oh, here we go. Joy interrupted with a nervous laugh, looking toward the audience as if seeking their support. The great Denzel Washington is about to lecture us poor, ignorant folks about how the world really works. Sit down, Denzel said quietly, his voice cutting through her sarcasm like a knife. For the first time, Joy seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. The smug smile faded from her face as she saw the look in Denzel's eyes. This wasn't anger. This was something much more dangerous. It was disappointment, mixed with a quiet authority that commanded respect. "You want to talk about the real world?" Denzel continued, his voice still quiet, but carrying to every corner of the studio. "Let me tell you about the real world, Joy. The real world is where I grew up, in Mount Vernon, New York, where my father worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. The real world is where my mother cleaned houses for families that wouldn't even let her eat at their dinner table." "Denzel, I didn't mean," Joy started, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "No, you had your chance to talk. Now it's my turn." His voice was steady, measured, but there was an undercurrent of power that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "The real world is where young men who look like me get followed around stores, get pulled over for driving nice cars, get assumed to be criminals before they even open their mouths. That's the real world I'm talking about in my film." Joy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly regretting her choice of words. "I understand that. But surely you can see that there are 2 sides to every story." "2 sides?" Denzel's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "Joy. When a man is lying on the ground with a knee on his neck, gasping for breath, begging for his life, what's the other side of that story? When a 12-year-old boy is shot within seconds of police arriving on the scene, what's the other side? When a woman is killed in her own bed by officers who broke into the wrong apartment, what's the other side?" The studio had gone completely silent. Even the production crew had stopped moving, transfixed by the raw emotion in Denzel's voice. Joy, for her part, seemed to be shrinking into her chair, finally understanding that she had awakened something she couldn't control. I wasn't trying to minimize those tragedies," she stammered, her usual confidence completely evaporated. "But you have to admit that you're using your platform to promote a very one-sided view of law enforcement." Denzel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "One-sided? Joy, do you know what one-sided looks like? One-sided is when officers who commit crimes get desk duty while the families of their victims get death threats. One-sided is when peaceful protesters get tear gas while armed militants get escorted safely away. One-sided is when people like you sit in your comfortable studios and tell people like me to be more balanced while our communities are under siege. That's not fair," Joy protested, her voice taking on a whining quality that only served to highlight how out of her depth she was. "I've always been supportive of civil rights, of equality. I'm one of the good guys here." "The good guys?" Denzel repeated, his voice now carrying a note of incredulity. "Joy, you've spent the last 15 minutes trying to convince me that the stories I'm telling, the experiences of my community, are somehow biased or unfair. You've dismissed the pain and suffering of countless families as being one-sided. And you think that makes you one of the good guys?" Joy looked around the studio desperately, seeking support from her co-hosts, from the audience, from anyone. But everyone was watching Denzel, hanging on his every word. She had lost control of her own show, and everyone in the building knew it. "I think maybe we should take a commercial break," she suggested weakly, reaching for her earpiece to communicate with the control room. "No," Denzel said firmly, his hand moving to cover the earpiece. "We're not taking a break. You started this conversation, Joy, and we're going to finish it. You wanted to talk about responsibility? Let's talk about your responsibility." The color drained from Joy's face as she realized there was no escape route. She had backed herself into a corner, and Denzel Washington was not the kind of man to let someone off the hook when they had crossed a line. "You have a platform too, Joy," Denzel continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Millions of people watch this show every day. They trust you to ask fair questions, to treat your guests with respect, to engage in meaningful dialogue. But instead, you use your platform to ambush people, to try to score cheap political points, to embarrass guests who don't fit into your narrow worldview. I was just doing my job, Joy protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I was asking the tough questions that viewers want answered. Your job? Denzel's voice rose again, and this time there was no mistaking the anger beneath the surface. Your job is to be a journalist, Joy, not a prosecutor. Your job is to inform your audience, not to humiliate your guests. Your job is to seek truth, not to push your own agenda. Joy's face had gone completely red, whether from embarrassment or anger, it was impossible to tell. How dare you lecture me about journalism? She snapped, her defensive instincts finally kicking in. I've been doing this longer than you've been making movies. I don't need some Hollywood actor telling me how to do my job. That was the final straw. Denzel's composure, which had been hanging by a thread, finally snapped completely. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The controlled, dignified man who had been trying to have a rational conversation was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes blazed with righteous fury. When Denzel spoke, his voice carried the weight of every injustice he had ever witnessed, every slight he had ever endured, every story he had been told by people who looked like him and had suffered in silence. Some Hollywood actor? He repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Joy, let me tell you something about this Hollywood actor. This Hollywood actor grew up in a world where he had to be twice as good to get half as much. This Hollywood actor has spent 40 years building a career, while people like you questioned whether he deserved every role he got. This Hollywood actor has used his success to lift up others, to tell stories that matter, to shine light in dark places. Joy tried to interrupt, but Denzel held up his hand again, and this time, the gesture carried such authority that she immediately fell silent. But you know what really gets me, Joy? It's not that you disagree with me. It's not even that you're trying to put words in my mouth or twist my message. What gets me is the disrespect. The casual, thoughtless disrespect that you think you can get away with because you're sitting behind that desk and I'm just a guest on your show. The studio was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Even the camera operators had stopped adjusting their equipment, afraid that any movement would break the spell that Denzel had cast over the room. Joy sat frozen in her chair, her mouth slightly open, clearly understanding for the first time that she had gone too far. You think because you've been on television for a few years that gives you the right to talk down to me? Denzel continued, his voice rising with each word. You think because you have a microphone and a camera that you can dismiss my experiences, my community, my truth, as being one-sided or biased. Denzel, please. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Joy stammered, her voice shaking. I never meant to disrespect you. I have nothing but admiration for your work, for your career. A misunderstanding? Denzel laughed, but it was a sound devoid of any warmth. Joy, the only misunderstanding here is your belief that you could sit across from me and question my integrity, my motivations, my right to tell the stories I want to tell, and somehow think that was acceptable behavior. Joy looked desperately toward the control booth, clearly hoping that someone would cut to commercial or end the interview. But the producers were as transfixed as everyone else, watching one of the most powerful moments in television history unfold before their eyes. You want to know about responsibility? Denzel asked, leaning forward until he was mere inches from Joy's face. Here's your responsibility. Aperch, Marketras. Your responsibility is to recognize that when you invite someone onto your show, you're entering into their space, their time, their story. Your responsibility is to come prepared, to ask intelligent questions, to engage in meaningful dialogue. Your responsibility is to treat your guests with the same respect you would want to be treated with. I do treat my guests with respect, Joy protested weakly, but even she didn't sound convinced by her own words. Do you? Denzel asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Is that what you call what happened here today? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you invited me on your show so you could ambush me? So you could try to make me look like some sort of radical extremist for having the audacity to make a film about real issues affecting real people. Joy's face was now bright red, and she was clearly struggling to maintain any semblance of composure. I wasn't trying to. I just think that when someone has a platform like yours— Stop, Denzel said firmly, cutting her off mid-sentence. Just stop. Every word that comes out of your mouth is making this worse. You're not apologizing. You're not acknowledging what you did wrong. You're just making excuses and trying to justify your behavior. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Several audience members had their hands over their mouths in shock, while others were leaning forward in their seats, afraid to miss a single word. The other hosts of The View sat in stunned silence, completely unable to regain control of their own show. You know what the real tragedy is here, Joy? Denzel asked, his voice becoming quiet again, which somehow made his words even more powerful. The real tragedy is that you had an opportunity today. You had an opportunity to have a real conversation about real issues. You had an opportunity to ask thoughtful questions about art, about storytelling, about the responsibility we all have to each other. But instead, you chose to turn this into some sort of gotcha moment. I was just trying to give viewers a balanced perspective, Joy said desperately, but her voice had taken on a whining quality that only served to highlight how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. Balanced? Denzel's voice rose again, and this time there was no mistaking the anger. Joy, there is nothing balanced about dismissing the experiences of an entire community. There is nothing balanced about telling someone that their truth is biased. There is nothing balanced about using your platform to silence voices that make you uncomfortable. At that moment, something unprecedented happened. The audience, which had been silent throughout the entire confrontation, began to applaud. It started with just a few people. But within seconds, the entire studio was on their feet, giving Denzel a standing ovation. Joy looked around in horror as she realized that her own audience was applauding the man who had just thoroughly dismantled her on live television. Cut to commercial, she hissed into her earpiece. But the applause was so loud that the control room couldn't hear her. Cut to commercial now. But Denzel wasn't finished. He stood up from his chair and looked directly into the main camera, addressing the viewers at home with the same intensity he had been directing at Joy. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying over the applause. This is what happens when people in positions of power think they can silence voices that challenge their worldview. This is what happens when journalists forget that their job is to seek truth, not to push agendas. This is what happens when respect becomes a foreign concept. Joy frantically gestured to the producers, and finally, mercifully for her, 2 stage managers appeared from behind the cameras. They approached her chair hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with what they had been asked to do. Miss Behar, one of them said quietly, we need you to come with us. What? Joy's voice was shrill with panic. This is my show. You can't remove me from my own show. Ma'am, we have our orders. The other stage manager said, gently but firmly taking her by the arm. We need to get you off the set. The audience watched in stunned silence as Joy Behar, the host of The View, was physically escorted off her own set while the cameras continued to roll. Her protests could be heard echoing from backstage as she was led away, but they only served to highlight how completely she had lost control of the situation. Denzel remained standing at the interview table, his composure completely restored. He straightened his tie, looked directly into the camera one final time, and spoke with the quiet dignity that had made him one of the most respected figures in entertainment. The truth doesn't need to be balanced, he said simply. The truth just needs to be told. The cameras finally cut away, but not before capturing one final shot of the empty chair where Joy Behar had been sitting just moments before. The most explosive confrontation in daytime television history was over, but the impact would be felt for years to come. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Joy Behar completely out of line, or was she just doing her job as a journalist? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more breakdowns of the most dramatic moments in entertainment history.